If that starts knocking over, let me know, because it's precarious. All right, so here's the sketch that Mr. Jones was working on in the video, and you can see just kind of how he's gone about doing that. So what you're going to do is you're going to do this in your sketchbook. We'll render one with marker in your sketchbook, and then before you render it in your marker, make a copy, about twice the size, so that you can trace it on marker paper. Does that make sense? So I'll go over this first, and then we'll talk about marker paper, or your more finalized rendering, because what I have is not technically marker paper. It is called Bristol board. I left my marker paper at home, but this reacts very similar to marker paper. If you feel it, it's got that very smooth surface. So this will absorb a little bit more than marker paper will, but a lot of the ink will still sit on top of the paper. So if you're ever looking for a more opaque paper for your final renderings, Bristol board is a really good resource. A lot of illustrators who use markers for their drawings use Bristol board. So that's another option for you guys when you're working on final renderings. But let's get started. So first things first, I'm assuming everybody has alcohol-based markers, not water-based or pigment markers. Yes, okay, good. So this will be pertinent to you guys. Alcohol-based markers are alcohol-based, meaning that the fluid that moves the pigment around is alcohol, rubbing alcohol, basically. So if you have Prismacolor markers, they're not refillable, but you can extend the life a little bit if their Prismacolors last a long time. I still have mine from college, but if they do run out, because bullet nibs tend to run out faster than the thicker nibs, you can actually soak them in rubbing alcohol for a little bit and extend their life. It will dilute the color a little bit, but if you are unable to go to the store and get a marker, that's a good way to kind of use up the last of that ink. So what we're going to do is, in your sketchbook, you can do a gray toned, or you could do a color, either way. But then you're going to trace that twice onto marker paper once you make the copy, and do one gray tone again and one colored, monochromatic. So let's do the gray tone first. So your kits may or may not have come with a large selection of grays. Anybody who doesn't have any grays? Awesome, great. So grays are definitely a necessary color. And I want you to notice that the grays in here have different tones. So you see some of them are warm colors and some of them are cool grays. Do not mix warm grays with cool grays. Either use cool grays or warm grays. So the logic behind that is that it'll become kind of muddy if you mix them. The cool grays are made cool with the color blue. Warm grays are made warm with color red, and if you have French grays, that is tinted with yellow. So that's just kind of what you want. So I have cool gray number 5, 7, and 9. And I'm going to use, this kit has like 5 different cool grays. So if you have, the more shades of that color you have, the easier your gradation or variation from light to dark will be, the smoother that gradient, but not necessarily required. So if I had to choose 3, I'd probably choose the lightest, mid-tone, and then the darkest. And that would enable me to get a light, a dark, and a mid-tone, which is important for your depth. Let's see, this might be easier if I sit down. I don't know. Thank you. I knew that was going to happen. You just hold it the whole time, Carly. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I don't know if it's gonna stay.
Do it. Class experiments. Y'all can laugh if I break the school's camera.
Can this come up?
I don't think so. I don't know.
That's a stupid design.
Oh,
yeah,
good.
I think you can. I see a hinge.
You see a hinge?
Yeah, wait, someone get the other side.
Balanced again. I'll try not to shake the table anymore. All right, so One thing you're gonna have to pay attention to is that there's pencil on the sketchbook, right? The markers will pick up that graphite, especially if it's a softer graphite. So you might see a little bit of smearing if there's too much pencil lead. So what you might want to do when you've drawn this in your sketchbook is use either a kneaded eraser or just lightly go over it to remove any excess. So we might see that with this, we might not. Alrighty, so just have to make sure it's in frame. I'm going to start with the lightest color. Always start with your lightest because you can always go darker, but it's like cooking. You can't remove the pigment once you put it down. So I would generally start with the brush nib. So those of you who don't have a brush nib, that's what that looks like. And you'll notice it squishes. So that's why it's called a brush nib. It's very much like a paintbrush. And I'm going to just go over the whole thing. It doesn't go on the cap. With the lightest color. And I've got the actual image to look at. So this will be helpful for you guys to kind of study how actual lighting is, because what we did last exercise was a very forced and not a like photorealistic way of casting shadow because you don't have any ambient light in that first exercise. So you can use this as a source to understand light and ambient light better. So I'm just going to go over the whole thing. Tips with your markers. If you don't want any blotchiness, move fast. The second that ink dries, it stops blending, and then you have hard lines. If you have a large space, that's going to be very impossible to do, so break it up into sections where it makes sense to have sections. Does that make sense? You'll notice a difference in how it works with this paper versus with the Bristol board. So we're just going to go over the whole thing. I'm going to give it a nice even coat, or as best I can, an even coat. And then we'll go from there. So remember, with alcohol ink especially, the wet on wet is best. But it dries very quickly because it's alcohol, so you have to move really fast. So I'm just trying to kind of coat the whole thing with that lightest gray. With the metal, I could leave bits just blank with white paper, or I could go get a white gel pen and create highlights, that metallic highlight. So that's what I like to do, is the white gel pen, because I don't think ahead of time. I don't plan out my highlights. I just like to jump in. So I've got the lightest part down, and I can start adding shadow now. So I can look at the actual picture. The more coats you have of your pigment, even if it's the same color, the darker it gets. So before I go into my mid-tone marker or my dark marker, I can go in and start adding shadows and use that to help create that smooth gradient versus a choppy one. And of course, that depends. If you like photorealism, you want to practice that technique. If you like a more graphic style, then maybe you want that choppy color breakdown to kind of take advantage of not being photorealistic and just create a different look. So I'm going to go in and look at where the shadow is. Obviously the sides of the chair are going to be darker. So you guys can see that that already makes that darker. So also remember, I'm going to exaggerate the contrast between light and dark to make that pop more. So there is shadow where the chair seat hits the backrest because it is cushioned, so it kind of curves. The other side of the chair is darker, and the front edge of the chair is darker. And then this backrest seat is situated like that. So it actually sits a little bit on top of the seat. So we have shadow underneath that as well. So I'm going to make that darker. And then in the little tufting pockets there, that's darker. So I'm just going to fill that in with the marker. So we're just going to keep on doing that. And I'm just dotting it. I'm not being 100% careful about filling in the little circles that Mr. Jones drew. I'm going to dot the seat as well. And then just kind of going over, looking at where shadow is. So try to remember what you learned with Betty Edwards, drawing what you see versus what you think you see. You can squint your eyes if it helps to kind of see where those shadows are. So again, I'm just going over and creating layers to darken the areas I want to be a little bit darker. Then of course our legs. So this backrest is really dark. I will end up going up over that with the darkest marker. And so what that is bent steel, and it's very thin. So the flat part that faces up towards the bottom of the seat is really dark, and then that thin edge is really light. So I could plan that out and be very careful about leaving that space, or I could go in with the gel pen later. And I'll show you what I recommend for the gel pen. Since we're using gray, we're not seeing a huge amount of streaking with the graphite, which is great. So we'll see how that works with the colors. And actually this leg is a little bit lighter, so I'm just going to kind of go easy on that. And I'll just go in and layer on until I feel like I'm not going to see any more difference. And I'm actually creating lines with my marker for where you see where the leather has kind of been folded in for each of the tufts. So I'm creating those lines. And I will probably go back over that with a very thin pen after I finish rendering, because that's a fairly high contrast area, right? So I will go over that later, but we're just creating the start of that gradient. So that's the first layer of ink. So already you can start seeing some depth and shadow, and that's just one color, it's just layering. As you progress with different materials like wood floors and that type of thing, you'll use the choppiness that you can get with the markers to your advantage to create the illusion of wood planks and that type of thing. But for a material that is fairly monotone all over, you want to be careful with how you kind of ink that whole thing. So now we're going in with our mid-tone. And again, I'm just going to go over the darkest parts first. And it's just a layering process, so you guys can see how that enhances it even more. That being said, the edges where Mr. Jones inked, outlined with ink first, are always going to be the darkest. So if you want to try for a monochromatic or photorealistic look, I would suggest waiting on inking the edges, because in real life we don't have any dark edges, right? Unless you've got that type of material. But more often than not everything's going to be outlined in black. So that is automatically going to detract from the photorealistic look, but it will kind of help to make your object stand out. So you got to walk that line there. So again, I'm going over, darkening the areas I want to be darkest. I'm being a little bit more light-handed with this marker since it is dark and it's not a smooth step up from my lightest shade. So if I had used all 5, I could get a smoother gradient. But since I'm not, I'm going to be a little bit more gentle or careful with where I put my ink. And again, I'm going to draw those little folds in the material because those are fairly dark. I'm coloring in those little buttons, but I am being more careful now about kind of staying within those lines. And I just keep on doing that. And I'm still doing this pretty quickly, so you would be even more careful if this was a final rendering for a final presentation to a client. And there would be a lot more work. So we're just working with markers right now, but typically I go over markers afterwards with color pencil to add further detail or to add patterns. So for example, if there's an area rug and you have a background and then the area rug has a pattern to it, you would fill it in with a solid marker and then go over a color pencil to draw in that pattern, because the color pencil is opaque. So we're not taking full advantage of all our materials yet, but we will get there. So again, a few layers, and then I've left a little bit of an edge on that front leg there, and then they knocked the table. I'm going to darken the thinner edge on that back leg. So you guys see how that can kind of make that pop a bit. So I'm just looking at my picture. I think I am going to darken up these little tuft pockets a little bit more because there is a little bit more contrast there. And your kit probably came with a colorless blender, which is basically just a marker full of rubbing alcohol. But you can use that to play around with helping you blend. Be careful with it because if you put too much down, it can create a hard line where the ink or the liquid in here, alcohol in here kind of spread. So just keep an eye on that, but you can use that to help you if you need to. Because you'll notice if I go through the darkest part, it picks up that ink. So that's great. I can also, another technique you can use is if you want like your mid-tone but you want a lighter shade, touch the tip of that. And then you can kind of use that to get a shade in between your lightest tone and your darkest or your mid-tone. So you can use this as a way to close the gap between these colors. Does that make sense? So I'm using that to kind of fill in some of my seat because you can see right now it looks like there's just too much of a contrast between light and dark. So I can kind of look at where I want the highlights to be and darken everything but that. So I just keep on doing that, picking it up. And smoothing it out. And I might do that again when I get the darkest one because it still looks a little dark. Or I just keep on doing this. This can be a tedious process, but rendering is never going to be a quick and easy thing. Does that make sense? All right. So then, once I've done that, to clean off your colorless blender, just come over to a scrap piece of paper and just color until you get that done. Alrighty, so then I can come in with my darkest shade and really accentuate the shadows. So again, coming over here, this side of the chair is the darkest, or one of the darkest areas. So I'm going to fill that in. Underneath, the backrest is also pretty dark, so I'm going to fill that in. The side here, and this side. And then the buttons in the tufting is not really too dark, but around them is. So I'm going to actually go around those buttons now. Does that make sense? You guys see how that can make it pop? So I just keep on doing that. The back leg is dark, so I'm going to fill that in. And then the flatter edge here. Oops, went off out of line. All right, so just keep on going until you've got that done. So then if I have my color pencils, I could go over this with, to create any highlights that I missed or to help kind of smooth all that out. So when you're working your sketchbook, pay attention to what happens. It will bleed through with all the layers that we're putting down. So you want to grab a piece of copy paper and just put it in between so that you can protect the next sheets. Your marker paper should not ever bleed through. And then, if you need any highlights, like metallic highlights, the Signo Uniball Signo white gel pen is great for that because it's opaque, so I should be able to come in here and create a highlight on the edge. Or if this was metallic leather, or not metallic leather, but really polished, I could come in and do those white highlights. So that's not true to this rendering as far as like the leather finish, but if you ever need a strong contrast with white, this is what it is. All right, so any questions on that? This is going to take practice in getting a feel for the markers, so if your first time doesn't work out, don't get frustrated, just play with it. And so then, with your marker paper, you have hopefully copied this before you rendered it, scaled that up, and then traced it onto your marker paper. So then you can use a color. Don't knock over. So this will be a little bit more tricky in that it's going to be fairly harder, or it's going to take a little bit more work to get that light and dark, because if we're using just one color, you could choose, let's say we choose blue. You could choose a light blue if you have one, a mid-tone. That's more, this will be my light, mid-tone, and that's going to be a pretty strong contrast, but we'll try it. So again, same process. I'm just going to start putting down my lightest color and filling the whole thing. So you can see what happens with the pencil. So you want to watch out for that. But just keep on going down. You will also notice that some markers seem to be drier than others. This light blue seems to be fairly dry. So I'm just trying not to smear that. It's kind of hard with all those little dots there, but
You want us going over it with pen first?
yeah, it depends on what you want to do as far as style goes, because if you go over with pen first, you always have that hard edge, that black edge. So it might take some practice in figuring out what you like. For example, with anything dark, a dark wall, that'd probably be fine. You wouldn't really notice it because there'll be a little contrast. But when you have white in your space or your object, you're going to leave it the color of the paper, and you're just going to use a light blue or a cool gray to create shadows, because with white, it's not natural to have a blue shadow. You can see up here, but in your renderings, that helps to create the luminance of light, white, rather. Does that make sense? Okay, so you wouldn't want to outline anything white in pen. So what you might do is just go ahead and plan to outline anything that is dark. So for this chair, you could probably be fine doing that. But if you're working with a space or a product that you know has at least part white, just leave that part unoutlined and just be careful with the pencil. So again, I just used a mechanical pencil, and that's typically about 2B, so it's a fairly soft lead. If you use 2H or 4H, then you would have less issues because it's a harder lead, so there's just less graphite to smear. But the same process, I can start by layering the lightest color just to start getting those shadows. So darkening where I know it's going to be darkest by going over again. And just keep on doing that till you get as dark as you feel you can with that one color. And so then you progress to the next step. You could use the colorless blender in with the mid-tone to get that medium, that middle ground between light and middle. Does that make sense? Or you can just go straight in with that darker one. And I'm going to be a little bit more careful with this one than I was in the sketchbook. Trying to stay in the lines a bit more. I have never been good at staying inside of lines. But I'm just darkening, layering. And doing the same thing. Does that make sense? So you notice that this is really juicy marker. Do you see what it's doing with the lines? It's kind of bleeding out. So that you have to watch out for. With marker paper, that will not be an issue again, because this is Bristol paper. It's going to absorb a little bit more. Marker paper doesn't really absorb the ink as much, so you won't have to worry about that. But it is something to consider when you're using markers, because a lot of paper will absorb and make that ink bleed. And then next up, after you finish layering is go in with that darkest one and really just accentuate where you want to. And so right now that's wet, I can go in with my colorless blender to kind of blend that out. So you guys see what happens when it's wet on wet. It works a lot better. They react with each other and you can see the ink being pushed around, right? So I have that dark color on my colorless blender. I can come over here and kind of use that to darken the areas where I think needs to be darker, but maybe not as dark as that mid-tone. So I can play around with that and just work my way around, filling in the areas. Until I have everything filled in. Does that make sense? So the process is fairly easy. It's just getting a hang for how these markers work. Try working wet on wet, because that'll get you your best results. Once the stuff dries, it's not really too controllable. Any questions? Okay, so then I didn't go over this with ink first. So you could, if you have a light pencil, you could ink it with marker first and then go back with a regular black pen and ink it if you want, and then you can use your gel pen if you need to. Any questions on that? All right, otherwise it's gonna feel very much like it's a coloring book and you're just filling it in.